Hi everyone, thanks for joining us for the first installment in our Book of Hope conservation case studies. So with over 1,800 species now listed as threatened in Australia, wildlife conservation can at times seem somewhat pessimistic. But despite the challenges, there are also many amazing success stories, and there's heaps we can learn from what's working and what is not. With this in mind, the Threatened Species Recovery Hub of the National Environmental Science Progam recently coordinated a review of successful conservation projects in Australia and what we can learn from them. This review has grown into a book called Recovering Australian Threatened Species, A Book of Hope, published last March by CSIRO Publishing. In this first collection of case studies, we'll be taking a look at some of the threatened mammal success stories from the book, including humpback whales, arid zone mammal recovery, critical weight range mammal reintroductions, mountain pygmy-possums, and eastern barred bandicoots. If you like the topic, by the way, you may also want to check out WCC episode 22 for our interview with the book's lead editor, Professor Stephen Garnett from Charles Darwin University, where we discuss some of the factors associated with successful conservation projects in Australia. Now, being winter, it's also a bit chilly up here, so our serving suggestion is Irish coffees. That's coffee and brown sugar with a shot of whiskey topped with some heavy cream. And I've also got some delicious chocolate mud cake here with me. So without further preamble, let's get started on our first collection of case studies on mammals. Cheers, folks, and enjoy. All right, welcome to our first TSR Hub Mammal Conservation case study. We're talking humpback whales, and who better to talk that with than our main guest for today. That's Professor Peter Harrison with a Bachelor of Science. That's a double major in marine biology and zoology, first class honours in marine bio in 1980. He also received a PhD in marine biology in 89, both from James Cook Uni. He's the founding director of the Marine Ecology Research Centre at Southern Cross Uni, also director of the Southern Cross Uni's Whale and Dolphin Research Centre since 2000. With over 130 publications, he's a recognised leader in coral reproduction ecology and has spent over 30 years researching and teaching a wide range of marine science and ecology programs. Peter, thank you so much for joining us today. Very excited to be talking humpbacks with you.
Thank you.
Excellent. Now, I guess we should get straight to it. So, humpback whales, Megaptera novangulae. Am I saying that right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, look, humpback whales are amazing creatures. They're extraordinary marine mammals, and they're very large. They grow up to about 15 to 16 metres long and weigh up to 30 to 40 tonnes. So they're an impressive animal in the sea. Absolutely.
Well, I mean, amongst the cetaceans, they're one of the larger, aren't they?
Yes, so there are much larger cetaceans. So the blue whale routinely grows up to about 30 metres, so, basically twice as long. Fin whales are sort of in the mid-20s in terms of length. So humpback whales are not the largest of the whales, but they're amongst the most acrobatic of them, and that makes them very special for people who are viewing them at the sea surface.
Wonderful. Yeah, all those amazing breaching and tail displays are just really awesome to see. You can even see them from the beach fairly often off in the distance. They're that big.
Yeah, they're extraordinary creatures, and this acrobatic breaching, even though they're up to 35 to 40 tonnes in mass, the fact that they can actually swim so fast and then breach out of the water and crash back into it, causing these giant waves. They also do some really interesting things like tail and their long pectoral fins they use to slap at the surface to communicate with each other. So all of these complex interactions at the surface and between whales make them socially and commercially really valuable as extraordinary, iconic marine mammals.
Fantastic, and very, very interesting with all the acoustic communication that they're doing there as well, obviously.
Yes, so humpback males have evolved the ability to make these really complex vocal sounds that are often likened to songs. And this song pattern's quite extraordinary because it changes, it evolves every year. And what's even more interesting is that recently we've learned that elements of the song are transferred from population to population. So elements of the population from Australia's West Coast population can actually then be picked up in the subsequent year by the East Coast population. And then those song elements are then passed out into the Pacific. And each year, that song pattern evolves from west to east. So they're very complex and highly intelligent creatures.
Wow, that's fantastic. So they're almost cultural memes in the truer sense of the term, sort of individual bits of cultural communication that are transferring from one population to another.
Exactly, and that's what we're starting to realise. The more we study these humpback whales, the more extraordinary we realise they are.
Well, they're out there sharing memes with each other, so that's pretty cool. So look, we should start talking about the populations here in Australia and some of their threats, I suppose. So from what I understand, there's 2 Australian subpopulations on the west coast and the east coast. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. So what we have, Australia is very fortunate having these 2 massive sort of temperate to tropical coastlines along the east and west coast. So we have a population of humpback whales that migrates along the east coast, and these are born and bred in the Great Barrier Reef region. And we have the other subpopulation that migrates along the coast of Western Australia, and that breeds off the tropical northwest coast.
Right. Now, like a lot of other large cetaceans, I understand that unsustainable whaling was one of the major causes for the severely depleted populations that they were facing. How badly were populations actually doing prior to protections? I understand that they were at what people were calling critical levels.
Absolutely, and that's why humpback whales are listed as a threatened species under Australian legislation. So what we do know is massive commercial and additional illegal and unreported whaling by the Soviet fleet basically destroyed the Australian humpback whale populations last century during the whaling industry, and unfortunately destroyed many populations of other whale species around the world. In total, we know that an extraordinary 2.9 million whales were killed last century, and more than 2 million of those whales were killed in the Southern Ocean. What happened was that the whalers started to attack the largest and most easily accessible whales first, and then when they mechanised their fleets, they could start killing blue whales. So they killed more than 300,000 blue whales and effectively destroyed most of those populations. When they had sequentially depleted blues, they went on to the fin whales, and then they added humpback whales to the system, and more than 200,000 humpback whales were killed in the Southern Ocean last century. So these are extraordinary numbers of whales, and we haven't seen the recovery of the entire whale community in the Southern Ocean since that decimation. In terms of the Australian populations of humpback whales, we can't be absolutely certain what the natural population size was for each of those east and west coast populations prior to whaling, but some recent estimates and modelling based on the catch data and the rates of population growth indicate that on the east coast we probably had naturally about 26,000 humpback whales present migrating along the coast and breeding in the Great Barrier Reef prior to whaling. And we know that the west coast population was a bit larger than that.
Okay. Wow.
And so these are extraordinary numbers we're talking about. And what happened essentially was that initially whaling started off the southwest coast of Western Australia in 1949, targeting humpback whales and other whales. And then whaling was taken up on the east coast population at Tangalooma, in Moreton Bay and Byron Bay in the early 1950s. And each of those whaling stations took somewhere between a few hundred to up to 1,000 whales each year. That would have started to impact the population of these whales over time. But the major problem was massive illegal and unreported whaling by the Soviet fleet operating south of Australia. And they killed an extraordinary 25,000 humpback whales in just 2 summer seasons south of Australia between 1959 and 1961. And that effectively destroyed the east coast population and left only a small remnant of whales. Probably only a few hundred of the original 26,000 were still alive at the end of that Soviet whaling. And that resulted in the closure of the east coast whaling and then New Zealand whaling stations in about 1962. So whaling was the major impact on these populations.
Wow, those are incredible numbers. The interesting situation here, I guess, is a lot of the time with a threatened species, there's multiple threatening processes to deal with, and I'm sure whales are the same. You know, there's going to be other issues to deal with, but this seems to be like the single major main threat, which a lot of the times makes, you know, the threat kind of easier to mitigate because you've only got one problem to solve. But obviously with, you know, such a large ocean to cover and, you know, limited resources, there's going to be a lot of complications. Is that kind of the case?
Yes, you're exactly right. So you've highlighted a really important point that in most cases for most threatened species, it's multiple effects largely caused by humans coinciding to create a cocktail of negative impacts on those particular populations and species. In the case of whales, it really was focused around commercial whaling and the mismanagement and totally inadequate management of whaling by the International Whaling Commission and its precursor. So theoretically, knowing what the threat was, it should have been easier to manage the process of enabling recovery. But in fact, it became incredibly complex because it's an international problem, and therefore you have not only politics at national levels, but politics and competing interests at the international level. So the international history of whaling is actually quite interesting, and the ineffective management by the International Whaling Commission was one of the key problems. We know that the International Whaling Commission was set up in 1946, and it was actually set up to manage commercial whaling, not for conservation. And effectively what the IWC did each year was monitor the decline of large whales in the catch records. They tried to start implementing some regulations to control commercial whaling, but essentially, as I said, it's a highly politicised and ineffective approach to managing this complex international problem. The IWC was also somewhat blind to the massive illegal whaling by the Soviet Union. The scale of that deception was only really revealed in the 1990s when some of the retired Soviet biologists who'd been associated with the whaling actions had kept secret copies of all of the records of the whale catches. And when those were revealed to some colleagues at IWC, they were encouraged to publish them. And at that stage, some of the restrictions and threats of internment and all the rest of it for those Soviet biologists were less, and that allowed some of the real records to come out. And it turns out that out of about 500,000 whales that the Soviet fleets killed, they didn't report 178,000 whale catches to the IWC. So the IWC was effectively blind to this massive, illegal, unreported whaling.
Wow. So you've got the IWC, who are effectively, they're basically a commercial organisation at the time, and then you have this massive, basically international cover-up. Where do we go from there? What kind of actions were taken? I'm guessing there was a lot of work internationally regarding law and policy, and here in Australia as well, trying to come to some kind of agreements on what to do.
That's exactly right. Well, in effect, in a perverse way, what happened when the Soviets basically destroyed the Australian humpback whale populations and effectively closed the operations of the whaling industry in Australia, that gave people time to think about the fact that these extraordinary animals were basically lost from their seascape, so they could no longer see them migrating along the coastline. And that allowed people time to think about these whales are actually marine mammals. They're highly intelligent, they communicate with each other, they do all sorts of extraordinary things. So people began to value these whales as living intelligent mammals rather than just a resource for oil and food. And that change in public attitude was really important because it led to public advocacy and anti-whaling campaigns by Greenpeace and other NGOs. And that effectively galvanised the conservation movement for marine mammals and other elements of the conservation movement in Australia and overseas. What happened as a result of that public change was, of course, that the politicians started to get a sense of changing attitudes, and then that led to increasing political support for some whale protection. So they set up an independent inquiry by Frost in 1978, and Frost recommended that Australia should actually protect whales rather than continue whaling. And that led to the government declaring the Whale Protection Act in 1980, and successive Australian governments have implemented protection for cetaceans, including whales, in Australian waters ever since.
Right, so now we've got the Whale Protection Act since the 1980s, and obviously community support, and so many amazing organisations are out there now. There's obviously been pretty much a 180-degree turn in the majority of people's attitude towards whales.
Absolutely, and it's this public attitude and this public support for protection of whales and dolphins and other marine megafauna that's really important, that underpins the whole process of conservation success and the potential for conservation. What we have now is all cetaceans, all whales and dolphins in Australian waters are protected under the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, and that establishes the Australian Whale Sanctuary in Australia's territorial waters. And humpback whales are also listed as a threatened species, and they're also listed as a migratory species, so they have multiple forms of protection under this Act. And one of the other things that's been really important about protecting and understanding our humpback whales is we've had long-term decades of robust scientific monitoring by various research groups along the east and west coast. And that's enabled us to track the population size and recovery rates of these whales, and it's shown that the protection in Australian waters and the international protection that Australian governments have been promulgating through the International Whaling Commission were having positive benefits. So it was important for people to see that all of these actions were having an effect, and therefore it was worth continuing with protecting these whales.
Right. It is always so important to communicate that success in any kind of threatened species recovery. And whales, I mean, once people can start seeing them off the coastline again, I imagine they get fairly excited. Now, I guess we've mitigated a lot of the pressures, but there is still some international, whaling pressure here on our populations, and obviously a lot of community support to try to curb that back and get some of it under control. What is the situation for Australian humpback whale populations now? I understand that they're recovering quite well because, as we mentioned earlier, it's that single threat, and at least within our territorial waters, we're doing our best to manage it.
Exactly right. So you've highlighted some key points there. So what we have is a fantastic outcome for Australian humpback whales. The East Coast population now exceeds what was thought to be the original population. So this year we're expecting to see more than 30,000 humpback whales migrate along the east coast of Australia, and that migration has already started. So we're starting to pick up reports from people down along the coasts and in boats along our coastline, seeing the first of the humpback whales come through.
That's excellent.
Yeah, it is. It's fantastic. And every time you see a pod of humpback whales coming through, not only is it beautiful to see, but it also reminds us of how close we were to losing our entire populations of humpback whales through this massive whaling that occurred last century. And what's really good news is the population is continuing to increase at more than 10% per year. So this year, for example, if we have a little over 30,000 whales, we'll have another 3,000 whales born into that population. And so the numbers keep growing very large every year, which is fantastic news. The West Coast population is even larger, but it's a bit more complex to monitor. But we do know that it's increasing at a similar rate, and if it hasn't already recovered now, it's probably very close to recovery. So in both the East and West Coast populations, we've got a really good conservation success story.
Fantastic. That's excellent to hear. Well, look, let's just, before we wrap this up, let's briefly go over some of the reasons for that success. So obviously, with those changing community attitudes and the value for this really iconic living species, there's been that pressure to cease commercial whaling and strong government action in international forums to protect whales, and funding for many decades as well.
That's exactly right. So it's really this combination of recognising that there's a problem, a change in public attitudes which led to a change in political attitudes to protect whales and other cetaceans, both within Australia's exclusive economic zone, Australia's territorial waters, and internationally. So Australian governments have been strong advocates of whale and other cetacean protection in the International Whaling Commission and other international fora for many decades now. That, combined with the reduction of whaling pressures overall, robust monitoring and ongoing growth, has led to the successful outcome of our humpback whales now recovered.
Awesome. That's great to hear. So the future of the species for now looks good. I mean, I understand that there's still pressure, but with continued funding and continued community support, seems to be looking good for them.
Yes, so at the moment we're looking forward to ongoing recovery and thriving of these populations as long as human actions allow for that. We do know there are some pressures. The Australian humpback whales and other marine wildlife are killed or injured in shark nets and fishing nets each year. Some whales are also harmed by large vessels that run into them as they come up to the surface to breathe. And somewhat perversely, as the population pressure increases, then more and more vessel strikes and things like that are likely to occur. So we do have a few concerns. One of the big concerns, of course, is the potential for the resumption of commercial whaling. One of the things that might happen, again perversely, is as humpback whales have now recovered, there is some perception amongst whaling nations that we should be able to start using those resources in some form of commercial scale whaling. So even though we've got recovery of our populations, the key thing, of course, is that most other whale populations around the globe have not recovered. So that the Australian humpback whale recovery is a little bit unusual. And given the ineffective global management of whaling by the WCC last century, any resumption of commercial whaling would be a cause for great concern. The final thing we need to be thinking about, of course, is the bigger picture, which is global climate change and ocean change. Increasing sea temperatures are causing major changes in the ocean processes, and the currents and the loss of sea ice around Antarctica, for example, are likely to affect krill populations, which humpback whales rely on during their life cycle. So that's one of the major problems, and related to that, of course, is we also have commercial krill harvesting that's ongoing at the moment. If that were to increase in an unsustainable fashion, that would then be a direct competition for food resources between humpbacks and other types of whales that are trying to use that essential food resource in order to power the energy supplies they need for these massive migrations they take. And the final problem we face is that the absorption of carbon dioxide by the upper layers of the ocean due to increased emissions of greenhouse gases is causing a change in the carbonate chemistry of the oceans, or what's called ocean acidification. And that, in effect, also changes the ability for some organisms to calcify and grow quickly. And some of those organisms include the phytoplankton that are floating around at sea, which form the basis of the food web for krill and other food resources for whales. So there's quite a few things going on in our environment that we have to be mindful of. So we need to remain vigilant and not become complacent about this fantastic outcome for humpback whales, because we have now a period of increasing human population growth combined with rapid changes in the Earth's marine environments, which could in future start to unravel the success of the recovery of humpback whales.
Wow, some very important points there. To consider that climate change not only affects us here on the land, but definitely affects the oceans and the primary production, and even the ocean's ability to not only absorb carbon dioxide, but to provide oxygen with those phytoplankton blooms. So very important stuff there, I suppose.
Yes, absolutely.
Peter, thank you so much for joining us. This has been an absolute pleasure. I really hope we can do it again at some point in the future.
Thank you very much. It's been great talking to you.
All right, no worries. Everyone, that's been Professor Peter Harrison. Cheers, guys. Much more wildlife cake and cocktails on the way, and plenty more case studies coming up soon. Cheers, folks. Bye. Another wildlife cake and cocktails case study coming up today for the Threatened Species Recovery Hub Book of Hope specials. Very exciting show for you guys today. We're talking arid zone mammal recovery with Katherine Moseby from Arid Recovery. With a PhD in reintroduction biology, Katherine is a specialist in arid zone ecology and reintroduction of Australian mammals. She spent over 20 years in wildlife ecology in numerous roles and has published over 40 peer-reviewed articles. She's also currently an adjunct lecturer at the University of Adelaide, Director of Ecological Horizons Consultancy and Principal Research Scientist and co-founder of Arid Recovery in South Australia. So, Dr. Katherine Moseby, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Excellent, excellent. And you're currently in and around the Arid Recovery area, are you? Down in Roxby Downs, is it?
I actually live on the Eyre Peninsula in South Australia at the moment, but travel up to Arid Recovery very regularly.
Okay, very cool. So Roxby Downs itself, about 500 kilometres north of Adelaide in the arid South Australian, pretty much a desert climate from what I understand, kind of going from freezing to at night time in winter to over 45 in daytime in the summer. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. It's got very low rainfall, only about 160 mils a year, which is very dry and very arid. So lots of red sand dunes, and the sand dunes are sort of separated by some interdunal swales, which have got a lot of chenopod saltbush on them. So yeah, it's sort of a very dry and inhospitable environment most of the time, and then punctuated by periods of really high rainfall where we get massive responses from all the animals that live there.
Right, so not a lot of resources going around, but when it does come, everything has a kind of a bit of a boom and bust ecology in those dry areas.
Yeah, that's right. So we can go from really high plant cover with grasses and lots of flowering shrubs and forbs, and then it can go to very just dry, empty sand dunes with not much on them at all.
Right. Okay. Well, look, let's talk about some of the problems there in the Roxby Downs area and I guess arid South Australia. I understand about 60% of the mammal species, mostly the medium-sized things like the greater bilby, burrowing bettong, morgaras, golden bandicoots, greater stick nest rats, and more. A lot of those are at least locally extinct since European settlement. Is that right?
Yeah, unfortunately we've got the worst extinction rate in the world in Australia, and the arid zone of Australia is the worst of the worst. So we've lost the majority of those animals that used to live there, particularly anything between about 35 grams and about 5.5 kilograms, which is called sort of the critical weight range for mammals, and they're the animals that have fared the worst since European settlement.
Right, so that critical weight range, is there anything smaller than 35 grams as far as Australian mammals?
Yeah, we've got lots of small mammals smaller than 35 grams, so things like hopping mice, things like dunarts, little native pseudomys mice, so they're still hanging in there, but anything sort of above that 35 gram category is either extinct or declining, and there's not many things doing well above that category.
Right, and above 5.5 kilograms, obviously things get a little bit more secure.
That's right. So and the main reason we've got that critical weight range, the main reason that those animals have declined is because they are within the prey range of the feral cat and the red fox, which is two of the predators that Europeans introduced to Australia after they arrived. So the combination of sort of domestic stock and rabbits and land degradation combined with that predation from cats and foxes led to really widespread extinction of a lot of species in the last 100 years.
Right. So I guess like many native arid zone mammal species and areas, struggling not just with predation by introduced cats and foxes, but also feral competitors. In particular, I think, as I understand, rabbits are a big one. Is that correct?
Yeah, so rabbits, not only do they sort of denude the landscape and prevent sort of arid zone shrubs from regenerating and eating all the grasses, they also provide a food source for feral cats and foxes, which means they can live in the country in high levels when the rabbits are present. So anything else that's around has to encounter a lot of feral cats and foxes, and they usually suffer worse than the rabbits in terms of predation.
Right, and I understand if you control just for the predators, then you kind of get that mesopredator release of some of those rabbits, and you can effectively have massive problems with competition then instead of predation.
Yeah, so if you do control your cats and foxes, your rabbit numbers go up, and then you get even less ground cover and even less recruitment of arid zone shrubs, which means there's less cover for animals to hide in, which means even the remaining cats and foxes can do a lot of damage. So it's sort of a vicious cycle. When you have areas with dingoes present, there's quite a lot of research to show that dingoes will control foxes and cats to a certain degree, so that could help some of our native mammals. But in a lot of areas of Australia, dingoes are excluded or hunted, and so they don't have that role either.
Right. So there certainly seems to be a lot of difficulties, particularly in regional areas, on kind of like some of the landscape scale management issues. Like it's quite, I guess, easy to control introduced species in just one area, but when it's such a big region that's being affected, the management of it becomes a bit more problematic.
Yeah, well, broad-scale control of feral cats is very difficult. Foxes, you can aerial bait, but even that is expensive and you can't do it over sort of hundreds of thousands of square kilometres. So a lot of our conservation efforts in Arid Australia has been to put animals onto offshore islands where they can be protected from cats and foxes, or to put them behind fenced reserves like Arid Recovery where we can also protect them from these predators.
Right. So I understand, Arid Recovery... with all of these threats to arid zone mammals in the area, you guys established Arid Recovery in 1997 to try to restore an area of that Roxby Downs, South Australia desert habitat to some pretty much pre-European kind of conditions. Is that pretty much the goal you guys started off with?
Yeah, we had a pretty unique opportunity because the rabbit calicivirus came through in 1995 and just decimated the rabbit population. So we went from something like 150 rabbits per square kilometre to one.
Wow!
Pretty much overnight. It came through very, very quickly, and it gave us a great opportunity to actually fence off and remove rabbits from a really large area. And that was our original intention. And then we thought, well, if we're going to do that, why don't we try and also exclude cats and foxes so that we can maybe bring back some of these animals from the desert. So we started off with just a 14 square kilometre exposure, and we've gradually increased that over time, and we've now got 123 square kilometres of country that's completely fenced off, and we've got different paddocks with different treatments within that. But yeah, it was a pretty huge effort over a number of years just to fence through that country, and also to remove the rabbits who are even though there wasn't many rabbits there, they were particularly difficult to get rid of.
I understand it, particularly if they were the ones that survived all the other, control measures that have been put against them. And so I understand that you guys have 6 contiguous exclosure fences now. So basically 6 different areas that you can apply and then also learn how to put into practice some of these different management principles for the arid zone.
Yeah, so our main focus, I guess, is research. So although we're a conservation organisation and we do a lot of reintroductions and conservation work, we're really about trying to research, how the country used to operate before European settlement, how we can best try and restore the country on a broader scale, what threatened these species and what is still threatening them, and how we might offset that. So all of the things we do at Arid Recovery are really based on research and adaptive management so that we can really learn as much as we can about the system and what's going on.
Right. So definitely trying to apply and then disseminate some of those lessons. So, for example, I understand that you guys had one of the first successful mainland introductions of the greatest stick nest rat, which is hugely threatened.
Yeah, that's right. So we're currently the only safe mainland population for the species. They are on some offshore islands, so they're doing all right. But this is an animal that used to be found over most of southern Australia, all through the saltbush and the bluebush. It's a beautiful little native rodent. It builds a huge nest out of sticks that can be sort of 1.5 metres high and 1 metre, 2 metres across. And it has a little nest inside the sticks, and that's where it raises its young. And it often has a partner with it, and there'll be nests sort of dotted around the landscape wherever they can find a bush to start building their nest inside. And this species went extinct on the mainland very quickly, and was only found on the Franklin Islands. Basically, that was the only place left in the whole of Australia. So we nearly lost that species completely. Many of the other species weren't so lucky, so things like pig-footed bandicoots and gould mice are completely extinct on the mainland, but we did manage to hang on to one pocket of stick nest rats. So we brought them back to the Arid Recovery Reserve after we got rid of all the rabbits and the cats and foxes, and they've done really well in there. They've set about building their nest straight away. We got breeding within the first year, and it really showed that as long as you could exclude these cats and foxes, these animals could re-establish.
Right, so that's really cool. I understand that you guys have also had a bit of success with some other threatened species that have been reintroduced into the area as well. I guess with some of the causes of the declines, identified and effectively managed and mitigated. How are things doing now? Are you seeing actual populations of those threatened mammals stabilising and increasing?
So we've got 4 species at the moment. We've got the burrowing bettong, the greater bilby, the western bar bandicoot and the stick-nest rat. And it's actually very interesting watching how their populations fluctuate over time. So each species is different. The bilby will fluctuate in response to rainfall. So we get some good rains and the numbers will go up. We get some dry conditions and the numbers will go down. Things like burrowing bettongs, they've just kept increasing since release. So they're a macropod, a kangaroo species, and so they have kept breeding until they're actually now in quite large numbers. So we're just looking at now reintroducing the western quoll, which is a native predator, and we're hoping that will help to stabilise some of those bettong populations and just, I guess, bring a bit more balance to the ecosystem that we've got inside the fence.
Right, that's very cool. I guess being macropods, they can have one gestating and one in diapause and one in young at foot bouncing around at some stage, basically. Is that kind of the situation?
Yeah, they're pretty prolific breeders. They can have 3 young a year, and they can just have continuous breeding. And even when it's dry conditions, you often see them with pouch young as well. So they're just great colonising species, great, really tough desert animals. They live in a warren. They're the only macropod to live permanently in warrens, and so they get underground when it's hot in summer. They can sit out the hot weather, and they're very, very omnivorous, so they'll basically eat anything they can find. So they're real tough little desert dwellers, and they've done really well at Arid recovery, and again, sort of indicating that if you can get rid of the cats and foxes, these animals seem to thrive.
Wow, that's really cool. You guys are obviously having some pretty successful recoveries of some of those mammal populations there. To the point that you have to start introducing native predators is definitely a very good thing. Yeah,
absolutely. And I guess we're also doing quite a lot of research on how we can get these animals out beyond the fence. So even though we have 123 square kilometres, it sounds big, but it's not really that large in the scheme of things. So I guess our aim is to try and research different ways we can get these animals to coexist with feral cats, or ways we can control feral cats and foxes, so that we can really ultimately get these animals out beyond fences into the wider landscape.
Yeah, fantastic. So I guess we have to wrap things up pretty soon, but I guess what are in your opinion, some of the reasons for all the success? Obviously, you've got a dedicated team there with some really amazing volunteers who've been with the project for a long time. And what's different about Arid recovery that makes it successful in your eyes?
Well, we have been very lucky to have a long-term funding provider. So it started off as a partnership between Western Mining Resources, WMC Resources, and the University of Adelaide, National Parks and the community. And Western Mining was taken over by BHP Billiton, and they have continued to support the project. So we're 20 years old now, and we've been supported that whole way through, which means it's allowed us to sort of, I guess, plan in the longer term, give staff job security, being able to afford to have a fence and to maintain it. So those things, that sort of security of baseline funding has been really, really important. I think another thing as well that makes Arid recovery a little bit different is it's really about learning and research, and I think coming up with new research ideas and disseminating those out there sort of keeps Arid recovery fresh and keeps people interested and people wanting to volunteer there, because they can see that, I guess, it's not a zoo. We're not here to just have animals behind bars. We're actually here to try and make a difference and change things in the longer term.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So obviously having, long-term funding helps you guys do some pretty sort of adaptive and high-quality research and management out there, which is really interesting.
Yeah, just having the university involvement as well means we get access to research students. We have a very strong community support as well, which has been great. And the staff at Arid Recovery over the last 20 years have just been the most hard-working and passionate group of people that I've ever worked with. So we've been really lucky that we attract, even though we're in the middle of nowhere and it's quite isolated and it's very hot in summer, it doesn't seem to deter a whole team of really amazing people from coming up and joining us. So we always welcome volunteers and good students. So if anyone's interested, get in contact.
Hey, there's always somebody who likes to be covered in red sand and flies and dust and sweat. If it's for the animals and for conservation, there's always people happy to do it.
Absolutely.
No worries. And how's the future looking for Arid Recovery and your introduced species at the moment?
Well, we've got a pretty exciting project at the moment, apart from the quolls going in, which is going to be really interesting to see how they change the ecosystem and interact with the other species in there. We're also doing a project where we're looking at trying to get cats to coexist with bettongs and bilbies. So we're exposing bettongs and bilbies in one section of our reserve to very low levels of cats, just to see whether over time they might be able to adapt, or they might learn how to avoid them as predators. They might improve their anti-predator behaviour. So we're getting some really interesting results at the moment, where those animals in with the cats are changing their behaviour, are becoming more predator aware. So so really keen to see how that plays out over the next few years.
That's fantastic. If you can release some, animals that are not cat naive after living in the safety of Arid Recovery, that they may do a bit better outside the fences.
Oh, that's the hope. I mean, it's a proof of concept at the moment, so it's something that could take many, many years to get that level of awareness in there, but it's certainly worth making a start now and see where it heads.
Very cool, very cool. Well, look, you guys are obviously in a fantastic position to do those kind of research projects and work on this kind of these management principles. So hats off to you guys. And cheers. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been fascinating.
No worries. Pleasure.
All right, thanks everybody. That was Dr. Katherine Moseby. Plenty more wildlife cake and cocktails case studies coming up shortly. Cheers. Talk to you soon. Bye. And another fantastic wildlife cake and cocktails case study from the Threatened Species Recovery Hub Book of Hope for you today. We're talking with Mr. John Kanowski from the Australian Wildlife Conservancy regarding critical weight range mammal introductions. Dr. John Kanowski is an ecologist and the National Science and Conservation Manager at the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, an independent non-profit conservation organisation here in Australia, buying up a lot of reserve land and then restoring and managing the biodiversity there. John has a Bachelor of Arts in English Lit, as well as a Bachelor of Applied Science with honours, moving on to a PhD in Ecology, studying rainforest possums and tree kangaroos. He's moved on to a Research Fellow position investigating the biodiversity value of rainforest restoration projects, and in 2008 joined the AWC as a regional ecologist for North East Australia. And since 2014, he's been working as managing the AWC's National Science Progam. John, thanks so much for joining us. Great to be talking AWC mammal conservation.
A pleasure. Nice to talk to you.
Excellent, mate. And you're calling, we're calling you, I guess. You're in somewhere in lovely northern Queensland, is that correct?
That's right. I'm working from home, and outside lots of lovely gum trees and the odd swamp wallaby wanting to be fed a banana.
Wow, you make working from home sound even nicer.
Yeah, no, it's good. Certainly, I don't. I spend most of my day looking at a computer like everyone else, but when I have a break, it's nice.
Yeah, fantastic. All right, well, look, we better get into it. So let's talk. We've previously already been discussing some critical weight range mammals here in Australia. So for those of our listeners, can you tell us a little bit about this critical weight range, or CWR, as it's been referred to here?
Sure. So Australia's mammal fauna has a whole lot of these small to medium-sized mammals that are highly vulnerable to extinction. We've lost 10% of our mammal fauna, and there's another, I think 30% that are threatened. And most of those are the small to medium-sized mammals that have been termed the critical weight range. That just sort of says they're the ones in trouble. And the reason these small to medium-sized mammals are in trouble is because they're snack size for foxes and cats. So the predators that have been introduced to Australia and that these animals are completely unfamiliar with, and so that's the primary cause of extinction of these species, and that's what a lot of our conservation projects address. We're trying to get them back into parts of their range from which they've disappeared, and increase their numbers generally.
Right. So with no predators here in Australia, obviously, like as powerful as a placental mammal predatory cat, our small to medium native fauna from 35 grams to 5,500 grams, so 35 grams to 5.5 kilo, are mostly at risk of predation from these introduced species that they're not really risk averse to.
That's correct. I mean, if you look at the size of a feral cat in the bush, it's not uncommon to get a 4 to 6 kilogram male cat. So those cats that size are capable of taking small wallabies. They often take the juveniles of wallabies, but they'll definitely take, pretty substantial size rock wallabies and the smaller ones like bettongs, a lot of the rodents, even things like brush-tailed possums, which we're all familiar with in the cities, out in the dry country where they spend a lot of the time, they're very vulnerable to foxes and cats. So there's vast areas of Australia that simply have lost almost everything in that size range. And these mammals played a lot of important roles in the country. They dug up soil, they burrowed, those diggings trapped the water and the nutrients, they dispersed seeds, they dispersed fungal spores. So there's a whole lot of processes that were integral to Australian ecosystems that these mammals played a part in, and now they've gone. Not only the mammals, but these processes have been disrupted. So, we think it's very important in conservation, not just to put a line on the map and saying that's it, we're conserving this property, but also to try to restore the fauna that used to be there.
Right. So, as I understand it, some of the losses have been so extensive in some of the native mammal fauna that you've almost got, in some areas, really like landscape scale ecological changes and disruption of the ecological processes going on. Like the soil seed dynamics have been changed. There's not as many digging mammals burying seeds and disturbing the soil, which would normally be happening at a much increased rate, and the cat predation is minimising that.
That's correct. Yeah, it's a sort of silent effect that you don't really notice until you go to a place which has these mammals. For example, one of our reintroduction sites at Scotia Sanctuary in Western New South Wales. If you go for a walk in there, it's very large. It's 80 square kilometres is the area we've fenced off from cats and foxes and reintroduced some of these mammals to, and they're occurring at densities roughly equivalent to good habitat in outside a fenced area. And, you're just constantly encountering diggings and soil being turned up. It's a really obvious feature of the landscape when you've got an intact mammal fauna, and it has all these knock-on effects for the processes that you mentioned.
Right, so feral cats and foxes, obviously some of the most significant threats there, not just extinction risk factors, but changing those ecological processes as well. Yeah, right. Now, I understand that the critical weight range is particularly for ground-dwelling mammals and in areas of low rainfall as well, so in some of those more arid areas?
Yeah, correct. Probably for two reasons, one of which I've mentioned is that where the trees are further apart, animals that are even partly arboreal, such as quolls, possums, end up spending quite a bit of time on the ground where they're very vulnerable to being taken by foxes, and cats can climb trees anyway. The second reason is simply just the productivity in the environment. In a less productive environment, you've got the capacity of animals to recover from predation is lower. So
yeah, right. Obviously, the disturbance is going to have a bigger impact in those drier, less active ecosystems.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. And then you get some interesting things happen too. In the deserts, you get these boom years where you do get a lot of rainfall and, the place just goes off. What's tended to happen since cats have been in Australia in particular is you get these massive cat plagues that follow a couple of years of above average rainfall, and it's those plagues of cats that really cause tremendous damage, like have a huge impact, for example, on the remaining bilby populations in southwest Queensland. And you're getting thousands of, the managers out in some of these properties have shot thousands of cats, and, it's just a dint in the number. So that's the sort of thing you got to keep in mind. It's cats are across all of Australia. There is not a single part of the mainland where they don't inhabit. We've done a lot of work in rainforest. They're in the middle of the rainforest. They're right out in the desert. They're on a lot of the islands. Foxes are across about 2/3 of Australia, so they're not in the sort of humid tropics. So together, the combination of those two is pretty severe for these mammals that we're talking about.
Right. So we've got our critical weight range mammals that are, obviously super at risk from predation, and so to the level that it's changing ecological processes. What's the AWC's approach to reintroduction and, I guess, mitigating some of these feral predators?
Sure. So we've done quite a lot of reintroductions. So at the moment we've got 5 large areas that we've completely removed foxes and cats from, and reintroduced some of these mammals. Now, if we could get away with not fencing, just with baiting or shooting or some other method of control, in fact, we'd probably do that. We've tried that in some places, but a lot of these mammals, they're just so vulnerable to cats and foxes that even very low densities of feral predators mean that you can't have a successful reintroduction. So where you've got an island, like we've got a large island in Shark Bay in Western Australia, 5,000 hectares. Once you remove the cats, that just had cats on it, and we got rid of the cats. Then, the sea is an effective barrier. So we put 4 threatened mammals back on that island, and they've all done very well. On the mainland...
Right, cats aren't exactly fans of water, are they?
That's right. Well, cats don't like swimming that much. On the mainland, you have to build a fence. For some of these animals, there's just no other way of doing it. So the larger, really, the fenced area, the better, and we've got the 2 largest fenced feral predator-free areas in the country at Scotia in Western New South Wales and Mount Gibson in Western Australia. And we've got a total of 11 threatened mammals that we currently have on these properties. Places like Scotia, we've got 5 living, 5 back in one area. Mount Gibson, when we finish it, we'll have 10. Other places, smaller fenced areas like Yucamurra, we've got 4. So they're sort of multi-species reintroduction sites where we're trying to restore both the faunal assemblage and the ecological processes that go with that for the benefit of the entire ecosystem. So that's our current work. And because it's been so successful, we've recently sort of embarked on a program of expanding our introductions to another 3 sites. So 2 we're currently working in a partnership with the New South Wales Government. They've contracted us to do 2 large reintroductions in New South Wales, one at a place called the Pilliga up in the sort of northwest slopes, and one at Mallee Cliffs down in the sort of Murray Valley area. And we're currently building the Pilliga fence, and we're currently planning for building the Mallee Cliffs fence. So those projects will get underway hopefully later this year, actually, with the first reintroduction of bilbies to the Pilliga. And the Mallee Cliffs project will end up with, 10 or 12 species that are regionally extinct put back into that landscape, and not only helping conserve the species, but doing those important jobs for the ecosystem. And the other project is a large project in Newhaven in the Tanami Desert, Central Australia. We have completed the fence there. We're working on on the eradicating the cats and foxes. That fenced area is about 100 square kilometres in size, and that will have, between 10 and 12 mammals reintroduced to it from remnant populations, whether they're on islands or in particular places where they've just hung on. So, they're the projects we're working on, and that will expand our species, the threatened species we're conserving of mammals in these fenced areas to, I think, 18. So, and that includes some of the most imperiled mammals in Australia. The central rock rat is listed as the most likely mammal most likely to go extinct in Australia. It just hangs on a couple of mountaintops in central Australia. It did occur, we think, in the New Haven area. It certainly occurred to in the mountains in the vicinity. And once we have the fence put up, we're going to reintroduce the rock rat as soon as we can to give it a bit of a fighting chance.
Wow, fantastic! That's a lot of different fenced and excluded sites. That's a that's a lot of predator eradication as well. And as you said, with New Haven, as I understand, that's currently going to be the largest cat eradication project in the world. Some 44 kilometres of fence. As you said, what is it? Around 10,000 hectares, and I hear that might even be expanding in the future to close to 100,000 hectares.
That's right, yes. So the Western Australian Government have been eradicating feral animals from Dirk-Hartog Island, which is 60,000 hectares. So that's the largest project I'm aware of at the moment. But we're certainly planning to have a larger area on New Haven behind a fence that will keep the foxes and cats out. So looking at somewhere between 70 and 100,000 hectares there, which is a pretty vast area. But more or less Australia as it was when Europeans arrived.
Wow. Okay. So look, you've got these multiple sites where you're effectively trying to manage a lot of the main extinction risks, and causes of decline. What's the situation for these critical weight range mammals now, and how successful have your reintroductions been?
Yeah. So one of the things that AWC is quite proud of is the investment we have in science. So we have now 50 ecologists on our staff, and a lot of the work they do is around tracking the numbers of threatened mammals, for example, on a reintroduction site. So that if people at Scotia, the ecologists at Scotia, earlier this year they were out doing trapping work and doing spotlight work to count the number of bilbies and bettongs and bridle nail-tail wallabies there. So we have annual data for all these sites, so we're able to keep a close eye on how the populations are going, and that's a critical input into management. If you don't have data on how things are going, you really have no idea how your conservations program is tracking. So that's fundamental to what we do. So a place like Scotia, we know that it's got just over 1,000 bilbies. We know that it's got over 400 numbats, and so on and so forth. We're absolutely able to track the numbers of these reintroduced mammals. So one of the really interesting things for me as an ecologist is that most of these reintroduction programs are successful simply from excluding cats and foxes. So, when you look at the literature, why did these mammals decline? A whole bunch of reasons have been given. People think that, competition with sheep or rabbits or, timber getting or changed fire regimes, predators, all these things drove the mammals to extinction. And no doubt they all played a part, depending on where you were. But we certainly have proven through the reintroductions to these feral predator-free areas that really, if you can remove that additional excess predation by cats and foxes, then most of the native animals, provided that the habitat is, reasonably appropriate, do well, do fine. We've had a couple of reintroductions that haven't worked over time, and where they haven't worked, we try to learn the lessons and sort of change it for the next time. So one example is there's a beautiful little rodent called the greater stick-nest rat that used to be distributed across most of southern Australia. It builds like a little house out of sticks and rocks and lives in there in a little sort of family group. They're super cute. They're a bit like a guinea pig when you
the
see
little
them.
stick hoarders of the desert.
Yeah, and we've reintroduced them onto Foray Island, and that reintroduction didn't succeed. And we think why is that when we let them go, they just bolted looking for where's my house, and there wasn't one because we were putting them there for the first time. So when we did the most recent reintroduction of that mammal to Mount Gibson, which is also in Western Australia, we first let them go into a very small fenced area. We basically put up a temporary fence, 20 metres square or something like that, just so that when we let them go, they wouldn't just go fleeing looking for their house.
All right, so you're kind of doing a little soft release locally, and
it's sort of a soft. That's all it took, and then we took the fence away, and they'd already said, this is our house, this is where we live. We built a little house. We'll base ourselves here. So, we definitely do a lot of research. So with our work with the Nest Threatened Species Hub, we're doing quite a lot of research around the reintroductions, what contributes to the success of reintroduction, and the aim for that is for us and for other people to learn from what we do so that the process can improve.
Right, and big plans in the future, obviously, with the New Haven fence and the introductions in the Pilliga. So future's looking good for a lot of these, critical weight range mammals if a lot of this stuff goes through, would you say?
Well, that's right. I mean, we certainly don't want to be in the situation where we're losing any more mammals. And the Australian Wildlife Conservancy symbol that we all wear on our shirts is the lesser bilby. Now, the lesser bilby has gone extinct not very long ago, maybe half a century ago. And it's absolutely a species that we could have kept had we, decided that, caught it early enough in the decline and said, righto, we're going to protect it in some of these populations. You can regard some of our fenced areas as essentially insurance populations. Over time, we'll work to release them outside fenced areas if we can get the fox and cat numbers down low enough. And in the distant future, we'd hope that there's going to become effective ways of controlling foxes and cats. And then we can see these animals, being part of the Australian landscape as they were. But that can't happen if we don't save the species, and so that's our current focus.
Fantastic. Well, awesome stuff. Hopefully, it all goes well. We're going to be keeping a close eye on that big New Haven project for sure. John, thank you so much for talking to us today. I think we've got to wrap it up here. Hopefully, we can talk to you at some point in the future. Yeah, absolutely. We'll have lots of stories to tell them. All right, no worries. Cheers, guys. Talk soon. Much more wildlife cake and cocktails on the way very shortly. Cheers, bye. All right, we've got another WCC TSR Hub Book of Hope case study coming at you. We're talking mountain pygmy possum conservation with Dr. Linda Broome. After a degree in zoology and wildlife management from the Uni of New England, she moved to the US and onto a PhD in ecology from the Utah State University Department of Biol in 1988. She spent many years involved in threatened mammal conservation, including with mountain pygmy possums at Kosciuszko and smoky mice in the southeast forests. She's currently at the New South Wales Office of Environment and Heritage, working on ecosystems and threatened species, and she's joining us now to talk mountain pygmy possum conservation. Dr. Linda Broome, thanks for taking the time to chat with us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Always happy to talk about mountain pygmy possums.
Well, they are a fantastic little animal. So let's get straight into this case study. So Burramus parvus, is that correct?
Yeah, Burramus parvus. Burramus is, so Burramus parvus Broome, in fact. It was discovered by a Scottish doctor called Robert Broome as a fossil in 1895 at Mittagong in the Wombian Caves. And its name's quite prophetic both for me and the possum, because Burramus comes from the Aboriginal word for rock is burra burra, mis is Greek for mouse, and parvus is small, Latin for small, and it's literally the Broome's small rock mouse.
All right, wonderful. So we've got Dr. Linda Broome here with Broome's small rock mouse. That's amazing. So first described in 1895 from a fossil jaw specimen and not found alive until 1966.
1966, I was found at Mount Hotham in a ski lodge. But because people thought possums lived in trees, they thought it had been brought up in firewood in 1966, and they didn't find it living in the adjacent habitat until 1970, after they'd found them at Mount Kosciuszko.
Wow, what a phenomenal discovery at a ski lodge.
Yes. They discovered them on Mount Kosciuszko itself in 1972, and there are no trees there. So there was this picture emerging of this intriguing little possum that lived above the snow line and didn't need trees.
Right. And for, obviously anyone who's listening, our Australian possums, they're usually arboreal. So it's very interesting being terrestrial, and usually they're much larger. So these guys, are only around 45 grams, and a really long prehensile tail. Some 14 centimetres of their 25 or so centimetres could all be prehensile curly tail.
They're terrestrial. They live in boulder fields or rock piles, hence the prophetic name of small rock mouse. And we now know that this gorgeous, charismatic little possum is a very unique Australian indeed. It's restricted to the Alps of the Australian mainland at elevations above 1,200 metres. Which is roughly the level of the lower level of the snow line, and it lives in rock piles or boulder fields, hence the prophetic name of small rock mouse. And it's the only Australian marsupial to hibernate throughout the winter under the snow.
Wow, so it lives in those alpine rock and boulder fields of southern Victoria, Mount Kosciuszko, and I guess southern New South Wales as well?
Yes, that's right, in the snowy mountains.
Wonderful. So obviously quite a specialised animal with not a whole lot of suitable habitat, kind of restricted to that alpine snowline rocky area. What was the problem for these guys?
So the problem is really small population size for a start. So we estimate there's less than 3,000 possums in the world, which is New South Wales and Victoria, above 1,200 metres. About 1,000 in New South Wales and 1,800 in Victoria. And their range has been declining since about the last Pleistocene glaciation, when they were much more widely distributed, according to the fossils that have been found in various caves. But since about 20,000 years ago, with gradually increasing temperatures, their range is restricting right up to the tops of the mountains, and they're now literally perched on top of the mountain from 1,200 metres to the top of Mount Kosciuszko, our highest mountain, which is 2,228 metres, and they're in a very precarious situation with climate change and global warming continuing to restrict the amount of snow cover.
Right. So obviously something that used to be much more widespread during colder times, as that colder climate snowline has sort of disappeared up the mountain, you've got a smaller and smaller area of suitable habitat as you go up the mountain. And then, of course, those peaks are restricted and fragmented.
And the other problem is now we find them only in these rocky boulder field habitats, which afford protection from predators such as feral cats and foxes. I think before there were feral cats and foxes introduced 200 years ago, they would have been more widely spread throughout the alpine heaths, but now they're restricted pretty much to those rocky areas which afford shelter from the foxes and cats. And the rocky areas also are important to them. Because their major food source is the bogong moth, and the bogong moth is a migratory moth that comes to the mountains in the summer, and it undergoes a kind of summer hibernation. It's called estivation in those rock piles, and provides a very rich food source for these mountain pygmy-possums. And so the mountain pygmy-possums can build up to very high densities in the areas where the moths congregate. But the other problem that's happening at the moment is with drought, and increasing droughts out on the Western Plains, which is where the moths go to breed during the winter. That affects the numbers of moths coming to mountains in the spring, which in some years recently, especially during the millennium drought years, we saw very low numbers of bogong moths, and that affected the possums as well.
Wow, that's fascinating. So, I mean, obviously, seasonal resources are really important for a lot of animals in Australia, but for a seasonal estivating moth to be such an important part of their diet is it's an amazing discovery. I guess, obviously, with these guys only being known since 1966, there's still a lot of stuff that's rather new about them.
Yes, since they were discovered in 66 in Mount Hotham, we've done quite a lot of research and monitoring and surveys of them. We've discovered they hibernate, we've discovered the extent of their distribution, a lot about their ecology, and also the threats that they're vulnerable to. And the major threats are a restriction of habitat, increasing global temperatures, which is decreasing the snow cover, so the snow cover is going further up the mountains, and that indirect threats too, because the snow actually affects the survival of the predators. So in low snow cover years, the cats seem to survive better, which increases the threat to the Pygmy-Possums, and it's quite a complex interaction with predators' diet and climate. Because again, in years where there's little snow cover and where there's drought and few bogong moths, the possums then have to go looking for food outside the rocky habitats, and there they're more vulnerable to being predated upon by the cats. So yes, it's not a good story for the pygmy-possum with the global warming.
Yeah, right. That's kind of a complex range of interacting threats, sort of the fragmentation, the isolation due to climate, and then things like bushfire and all these other potential risks. That's quite a lot for these little things to handle, I suppose. And you guys are on the front line at the moment, managing some of those threats, as I understand.
Yes, it is encouraging, because I started working at Mount Bluecow in 1986, and I've monitored the population there every year in November. And during the first few years, from 86 up until 99, the population stayed relatively steady at about 29 females and 14 males. But in 1999, we had a massive decline in males, followed sharply in 2000 by females. And we weren't sure initially what that was due to, but I'd seen some evidence of feral cats around the area when I'd been radio tracking these possums in the previous years. But in 1999, we discovered a litter of kittens in the boulder field where the possums lived, and also a number of birds and skinks with evidence of cat predation. So we started trapping cats, and we started a cage trapping program during winter in 2002, and that first winter we caught 30 cats. And then that was followed in 2003 by this massive bushfire, which burnt about 80% of the habitat. And 80% is Kosciuszko National Park, in fact, in the alpine area. So there wasn't much habitat left, but we caught another 20 cats that following winter in 2003, so that was 50. But with little cover after the bushfire, we still had a decline in the possums until by 2000 we only had 2 females left. And by 2004, we only had 2 females left. And by 2008, we only had 1 female left. And she was right on top of the mountain, and she only had half a tail. So obviously a cat or something had tried to catch her, and she'd managed to escape. So we continued. Yeah, it was a dire situation. So we continued our cat trapping, and we increased our efforts in 2010 with some help from the Threatened Species Commissioner at the time, Gregory Andrews, who provided us some money for a full-time cat trapper and a cat detection dog called Dottie. Now, Dottie is a wonderful dog, and she was able to help the cat trapper locate the exact position of the cat so he could more strategically put his traps in places that would catch the cats. And so immediately, once we started that, we caught another 20 cats, and to this date now, we've caught 177 cats in that Perisher area. But the good news was that in 2011, the drought broke, and we'd started catching more cats. And by 2016, the numbers of possums had increased again to the levels that we had before the millennium drought, which was very exciting. But the most exciting thing is last year, in 2017, our trapping rate exceeded what we'd ever caught before. And so we caught 45 females last year and 18 males, which was terribly exciting. And we'd also been monitoring and trapping cats on some of the other areas that had very low numbers of possums, and they've increased beyond what we had before we started cat trapping. So I'm quite convinced now that removing the cats has had a very positive effect, and the cats are a big part of the problem.
Right. Well, obviously being such a small mammal and not a whole lot of cover for them on those rocky fields, and being ground dwelling as well, they would seem to be quite at risk from cat predation.
Yes, that's correct. And especially if there's not a lot of food in the boulders, if the moths haven't turned up, the possums then have to go looking for alternate food sources, which include other arthropods, so beetles and spiders and caterpillars, which all live in the shrubs outside the boulder fields. And so they're much more vulnerable to the cat predation when they have to go out of the boulder fields. And they also eat nectar and seeds, so they have to go hunting for food outside the shelter of the rocks in a lot of situations.
Right. Now, obviously with the population being reduced so small, I mean, it's fantastic that they're bouncing back, but there's always a risk of reducing the genetic diversity in a population and having, a population bottleneck, and then having a very, I guess, homogenous population and not much genetic diversity following that. I understand that you guys have had to do some pretty targeted genetic rescue efforts as well.
Yes, that's the Mount Buller story, which Dean Hines will tell you more about. But based it's his specialty, Mount Buller. But yes, what happened there is the population declined to very low levels, and they became quite inbred. And they've had a very successful program of reintroducing males from other populations into the Mount Buller area, and have had dramatic increases in numbers there, and a recovery of the genetic diversity. And it's certainly something we have to watch with less than 3,000 individuals total. Even in Kosciuszko National Park, we found some more populations in the northern area of Kosciuszko in 2010 at lower elevations than we thought that occurred. They were down to 1,200 metres in the northern areas. But the and in the southern areas, we hadn't found them lower than 1,500 metres. And in the northern areas, so there's less snow, there's not as much permanent snow during the winter. But what we have found is that the boulder fields where they occur, there must have permanent water. If there's no permanent water, there's no possums. And so they're very dependent on a moist environment. But the other thing we found up there is that they are genetically quite restricted. So we're going to have to keep an eye on those populations. They've obviously gone through a bottleneck, and it may have been due to fire before we discovered them, because we only discovered them in 2010 and the fires were in 2003. But it's something we might have to take males from the southern populations up to those northern ones if the diversity decreases anymore. It's something we keep monitoring.
Right. Okay, so obviously with the threats of cats being managed and the population being monitored and so on, what's the situation for mountain pygmy-possums at the moment?
So at the moment they're holding reasonably steady compared to what they were when we first discovered them, but they're in a very precarious situation because of climate change. We can ameliorate some of the threats to them, like the foxes and cats. Again, that's a big ask because cats are hard to keep control of. We managed to cage trap them for some years, and then the ones that weren't caught in cage traps we got in leg hold traps. But now we've got some indication that there's a few cats out there we can't even get with the help of leg hold traps. So, we're back to a situation we need to keep on top of developing methods to eliminate cats. And ultimately, really, it's the mountain pygmy possum doesn't have a very optimistic outlook if temperatures keep rising, if we keep losing snow cover, and we have increasing frequency of droughts and fire with increasing global warming and climate change. And ultimately, to save the mountain pygmy possum, this very special icon of the Australian Alps, we need the global community to keep helping by halting and reversing climate warming and global warming and climate change. If we want to keep this animal for at least 100 years into the future and not have it return to being a fossil as it was initially thought to be, we need a global effort to stop climate change.
Right. Well, yeah, look, obviously with both local and regional and like global threats for this one species, dealing with just one thing isn't going to necessarily save it. Just dealing with the cats won't save it from future climate change, and only dealing with climate won't necessarily manage the cat problem.
No, that's correct. We need a multi-pronged approach and strong conservation programs to keep looking after this animal. In New South Wales, we have the Saving Our Species program, which is helping with the funding the cat control, and the federal government is also helping with their mountain pygmy possum being one of the 20 key species that they're trying to reverse the declining trajectory. But certainly we need to keep those efforts going into the future.
Right. So that long-term funding, obviously key to some of the success you guys are having with the cat trapping and getting the populations back up. But yeah, climate's still the overarching issue. Yes,
that's very true.
And I guess we do have to wrap things up in a minute, but how would you sum up the future for the species?
It's precarious. It's something we need to work very hard at maintaining this very unique animal. And yes, as I said, if we can halt climate change and reverse it and stop the temperatures increasing and droughts and fires, then we may have a chance of keeping this animal in the future.
And a lot of other species, obviously, as well.
Yes, that's right.
All right. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk to us today. Super interesting stuff. And hopefully we can take the chance to get to talk to you about mountain pygmy possums at some point in the future.
Oh, that would be a pleasure. I can talk all day about mountain pygmy possums.
No worries. That sounds like a joy. All right. Thanks again for joining us. And yeah, hope to talk to you soon.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, that was Dr. Linda Broome talking mountain pygmy possums. We've got one more mammal case study coming at you, talking eastern barred bandicoots. So we'll be back with you very shortly. Cheers, guys. Bye. Okay, we've got another Wildlife Cake and Cocktails case study for the Threatened Species Recovery Hub for you today. We're talking with Richard Hill about the Eastern Barred Bandicoot Recovery Program. Richard started his science career at James Cook with a Bachelor of Science in Zoology, moving on to the Uni of New South Wales for honours, and a Master's in 1996 at Monash Uni. Since he's worked at BirdLife Australia for around 12 years and has spent around 13 years at the Department of Environment, Land and Water and Planning, for Victoria as a Senior Biodiversity Officer. He's joining us today to talk about the Eastern Barred Bandicoot. Richard, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure, Amy. Good to be. Thanks for inviting me.
No worries. And whereabouts are you at the moment? Where are we talking to you from?
In Casterton, which is in southwest Victoria.
Wonderful. Yeah, nice. Obviously getting a little bit cooler down there, but a lovely habitat for these little barred bandicoots.
Look, it's on the far western edge of the range of eastern barred bandicoots. They're grassland bandicoots. So Casterton's on the a little bit just a bit west of what's called the Great Victorian Volcanic Plains. They're the sort of southwest plains which extend all the way from Melbourne across to just west of Hamilton, really. A very large area of volcanic plains which were grasslands and lightly wooded, grassy woodlands and grasslands. And the Eastern Barred Bandicoots was a specialist in those grasslands. Those grasslands are now all farmland. That's part of the story.
Oh, right. And you're kind of on the western edge of that grassland habitat.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. All right, well, look, let's get into this case study. The Eastern Barred Bandicoot, Parameles gunnii subspecies down your way. A small rabbit-sized marsupial native to Tasmania and southeast mainland Australia with about 3 to 4 pale bars across the rump. Is that about correct?
Yeah, that's right. A bit smaller than a rabbit, more a sort of large guinea pig almost. So about 800 grams or so. Yeah,
okay.
Pretty little. Yep.
Yeah, right. And the mainland subspecies, nearly extinct by the 1980s, with the last wild population occurring in Hamilton in southwest Victoria. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's about right. Contracted to there. So about by the 60s, I think. And this is one of the longest running conservation programs in Australia, the Eastern Bandicoot Recovery Program, and started in the late 70s in Hamilton.
Right. So now they're currently listed as endangered under the EPBC Act, threatened under the Victoria Fauna and Fauna Guarantee, and extinct in the wild under the Victorian Advisory List of Threatened Vertebrate Fauna of 2013.
Yep, that's right.
And we already mentioned, habitat loss throughout that grassland, being I guess a bit of a grassland specialist, and losing a lot of that to was agriculture, and I guess there's always an issue with invasive predator problems with these small mammals, correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yep. Look, this country was the most fertile country probably in Australia. Really, it was very, very quickly taken up after the settlement of Victoria. It's basically what drove the settlement of Victoria, and not just the estimates are about 1%, if that, 0.5% of the grasslands in the original, something like the original condition, still exists. So it's almost all either grazing or cropping. And on top of that, foxes arrived in this area around 1900, 1920, in that period, and the combination of those two things, because this is, and I think, we don't really know the role of cats in all this, but certainly foxes are thought to be, we can think of them as the number one problem for this bandicoot. And being a grassland, their habitat doesn't have a lot of cover in it, so they're probably particularly vulnerable to a new predator who was very good at catching them. And so, whereas things like southern brown bandicoots, some of the other species of bandicoots in Victoria it's certainly rarer than they were, considerably rarer than they were. They've persisted, and wild populations, reasonably viable populations of wild animals still persist with those. Long-nosed potteroo and southern brown bandicoot, the other two species we've got. This grassland bandicoot, I think, was particularly vulnerable to feral predators.
Right. I understand there's even sort of anecdotal historical evidence of fox predation on these animals.
Oh, sure. And look, for 20 years, this program tried to do in situ conservation, or tried to work on the animal in the remaining areas where they existed, with doing two key things: trying to increase the amount of cover and to try and reduce foxes in particular. As you know, there's no broad scale methods for cat control really. Certainly not available in Victoria, and so it's always been a story of trying to control foxes. And that program, there's 20 years of work and reintroductions, so lots of reintroductions in unfenced sites, trying to get, and foxes just taking ultimately all of those based on our reviews, failed ultimately because of foxes.
Yeah, I did hear about that. So over some 16 years, there's been attempt after attempt to reintroduce, and a lot of the populations failed because of, first of all, the obvious habitat loss, less than 1% of their original habitat, but then in those areas where you are trying to reintroduce them, fox predation is just too heavy.
Yeah, that's right. So we reviewed that program in late 2000s, and by which time we'd already started on a fence site or a couple of fence sites, and concluded that unfenced sites, in situ conservation. With foxes, just wasn't compatible. The bandicoot wasn't compatible with any level of fox density. That's what we basically, and so the program moved over to fence sites.
Right. So obviously, one of the main actions you would have been taking here would have been exclusion fencing, and I guess refocusing on predator control after I guess noticing how bad the fox predation issue is. Correct?
Yeah, so we basically, in around 2000 and the late 2000s, we revised our recovery a recovery strategy, if you like, a model for recovery, and said that we've tried unfenced sites. These things seem to be just too vulnerable to fox predation. At the same time, the population had been tiny for an extended period of time. We only had, we basically just had a captive population in 2005 and a small number at one new fenced site. So we had around 100 animals in 2005 in total, excluding the captive insurance population. So at that point, we'd decided that we had to rapidly increase population size, and the only way to do that we knew would work would be, well, we suspected should work, and were fenced sites. As I said, we had one of those already going. That was at an ex-Walmsley property just north of Geelong, and we re-established a new one at Hamilton, and over the next up to about 2010, we basically demonstrated that worked very well, and from then we've established another two. So the whole program has really shifted over to fenced sites as a way of rapidly increasing population size, really because loss of genetic diversity and rapidly increasing population size was the thing that we really had to do. Otherwise, we were losing this thing, and we'd lost 40% of genetic diversity by then. That's the estimates based on from 1990 to 2005, we'd lost 40% of our genetic diversity. So so rapidly increasing population size is the only way to stop that any further loss, and that's what we did. And that's been really successful. So we've got population up to as many as 1,500 in the last 5 years. Currently, between probably 1,000 and 1,200, something like that. And that's really taken the pressure off us in terms of losing continue. We've got to a point where population size is not an issue in terms of conservation of or loss of genetic diversity. So that's been our main thrust the last 10 years. Really, has been doing that.
Yeah, cool. So a lot of fencing, even at that, I guess at Hamilton, which was their last the last wild population in the 1980s, at least.
Yeah. Yep. So we rewrote the recovery plan in 2010, and set ourselves a goal of 4 reintroduced, 4 fenced sites within the original range, and that's because we want to spread the risk. You can't, one's obviously not good enough, two's probably not enough, and so how long's a piece of string? They're expensive. At the other hand, expensive to establish and maintain, and there's cost efficiencies in getting area as well. So area, the bigger the better. Sort of thing, but there are opportunities in this country because there's, it's mostly farmland and there's not very little of that, as I said. So anyway, we settled on 4, and we're just now finished fencing the 4th and what we think will be the final site, which is a 1,000-hectare site, and it's also our largest site. And so 4 sites and about 2,000 hectares was our target, and we've got 1,850 now, and so we're basically there, really. And those 4 sites together will support a population of size of probably 2,000 to 4,000, something like that. And our population size for recovery that we've set ourselves is 2,500. So we're very much on the way to achieving that.
That's awesome. That's great to hear that you're pretty much close to hitting those population targets. That's pretty good.
Yeah, that's right. We are.
Awesome.
Yep.
Look, you did mention genetic diversity briefly. I just want to bring it back to that just for a minute. So obviously, anytime you shrink a population, it goes through a bit of a genetic bottleneck. You're not going to have the same amount of variance and different genetic haplotypes and whatever.
Yep, that's right.
That are in the original population. You're basically going to take a small handful of jelly beans out of the jar, and those are the ones that you're left with as the population grows.
Yeah, so recognising that, we are doing something about that. So with Andrew Weeks, who's got an association with the Nest Pub, we've for the last couple of years been running a trial outcrossing with the Tasmanian subspecies, and we're pretty close to he is to finalising that, and our expectation is that we will use those animals using the sort of. It's been done very carefully to ensure there's no outcrossing issues, but we're pretty confident that we will be using those animals, which will have some level of Tasmanian animals in them, with the purpose of bringing that in, that is introducing new genetic diversity and purging what they call purging the deleterious sort of alleles. And I'm not a conservation geneticist, so you can clearly hear, but to get rid of any negative consequences of having that reduced heterozygosity and allelic diversity. And we do have some inbreeding issues we've recognised already. So we're definitely working on that, doing this gene pool mixing stuff, and expect to spread to introduce that new diversity across the reintroduced populations over the next few years. Once this work is complete, and Andrew Weeks has demonstrated that it's the right way to go, but we're pretty confident that's what we're going to be doing over the next few years.
Wow, that's fascinating. So you can use that genetic diversity that hasn't maybe gone through as much of a bottleneck in Tasmania to try to recover. It's not going to be exactly the same alleles, but you're going to get some extra diversity into the population nonetheless.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Very cool. All right. Well, look, what's the situation for the eastern barred bandicoot now? Obviously, you've got the 4 fantastic fence sites, and definitely having some population size increase. How much have the populations grown by?
Well, it's by about an order of magnitude in the last 12 years. So, from about 100 to 1,000. That's sort of, that's been really good. Look, the next stage, and one we've already started, is looking at introductions outside the range onto fox-free islands. And the first opportunity to do that, well, we did a little trial of that on a small fox and cat-free island in Western Port Bay, which is on the southeast of Melbourne. Anyway, you don't really know that. In Western Port Bay, we've got 2 large islands, which are our targets. But we trialled first on the smaller island, at a 100-hectare or 60-hectare island, and they did very well. We've been doing a lot of work looking at looking for unexpected consequences, impacts on other values, and those sorts of things. And that work's gone really well. And last November, we introduced some animals into Phillip Island, which is our second largest island. It's about 10,000 hectares, I think, Phillip Island, and there's a lot of potential habitat, and the most likely suitable habitat on the island is going to be more previously cleared country. Phillip Island was largely a wooded and vegetation originally, but the farmland and farmland edges are likely to be the best habitats for eastern barred bandicoots there. Anyway, it's early days, but the interesting thing is that Phillip Island's fox-free now. They've a lot of work by the Phillip Island Nature Park has made it fox-free over the last 10 years, but it's not cat-free. So that's going to be the interesting thing. We are doing work on cats there, but it's interesting to see the extent to which how successfully they can establish in the presence of a feral cat population, which itself is probably changing as a consequence of the removal of foxes. So anyway, interesting days. And we also have a proposal to try and do this on French Island as well. We're still trying to finalise the approvals and things for doing that on French Island. But the longer term plan is to maintain these reintroduction sites within the natural range, but then to have additional sites as introduced populations on our islands.
Wow, that's really interesting about Phillip Island. I guess one of the concerns would be obviously when you remove one of the 2 major predators, cats or foxes, then you can kind of maybe have a bit of mesopredator release on the other one, and their populations can grow a little bit. But I guess that's something that you're going to be monitoring fairly closely.
It is, yeah, exactly right. That's right. So it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out.
Very cool. Well, look, obviously you guys are having some pretty amazing successes here, increasing by an order of magnitude the population size, planning at least for releases outside of the 4 fenced areas as well. We do have to wrap things up shortly, but what are some of the reasons you think this program has been so successful?
I think we came up with in our review in the mid 10 years ago, we came up with a pretty clear sort of idea of our new recovery strategy, if you like, these fenced sites, and that we set ourselves a pretty specific target of 2,500 animals and minimise further loss of genetic diversity, and that's what we worked on that really hard for basically 10 years, and we had that recovery model. I mean, it's a fairly simple one, if you like, the fenced model, but it really was. We'd done almost 20 years of work to that point to show that. The more what you want to do, which is institute what didn't work, and so that decision really allowed us to work with on a pretty focused sort of way, and that also meant that other investors came in, or other suppliers came in. So we've had a really important partnership with a fellow from Western Victoria, a Melbourne-based fellow now called Nigel Sharp, who owns a number of properties in Western Victoria, including one and now 2 of our fence sites. He's been really important, and also Zoos Victoria has come in as a major sponsor of this program as well. So those 2 big sort of the investments of those 2 groups came along. Nigel Sharp and his sort of and the people behind him and Zoos Victoria, they came on because they saw that we had we sort of demonstrated success. We knew what we were doing, had a pretty clear plan, and they thought that was we're pretty not just confident of success. We'd sort of we'd sort of demonstrated the success of these fence sites at one of them, and we just had to repeat those at 3 different sites. So it was a pretty clear sort of vision of what we wanted to do, and they thought that was good.
Well, no, look, it's awesome to see that financial support and community and even zoos and everybody getting behind it, and that kind of strong focus between science and management leading to some really awesome outcomes for you guys is really cool. Just before we go, how do you think the future is going to go for this species? Obviously, looking pretty bright at the moment. Yeah. Look, it's good. Obviously, within the original range, it relies on fence sites at the moment. I'm not sure if that's ever going to change. But that I think it's important to maintain them within those sites and setting up sustainable sort of business models to keep on running those, because government funding is fickle, and just maintaining the commitment to keep those sites running, and that's one of the things we're working on. Just to develop up and. For example, this newest site that we're working on now is an operating sheep farm as well as an EBB introduction site. So it's an operating sheep farm, fine wool merino property within a 8,000 hectare predator-free area. So that's the sort of stuff we're doing to try and make this more sustainable in the long term. So it's not so reliant on government funding. And with those sorts of things, and islands as well, the island introductions, the results of those looking pretty promising. Yeah, and look, I think this has a pretty bright future. Yeah, that's from where I'm sitting. I reckon it's looking pretty solid. Hey, that's always good to hear. And look, you guys have obviously put in a lot of research and management into it, so it is good to see outcomes like this. Yeah, really, really, really awesome. Thanks, Johnny. Yep, I've really enjoyed working on it. And also, of course, it's a real team effort. It's the other thing. There's a recovery team and DELPA. We're just one small part of lots of different organisations that made this all happen. Yeah, obviously, look, big projects and conservation projects like this, they require so much support and so many people and so much input from so many angles. It's kind of hard to fathom a lot of the time. But look, I think we're going to have to wrap it up there for now. Richard, thanks so much for joining us. This has been super awesome. And look, would really love to talk to you about this in the future if we get the chance. Thanks, Yanni. It's been good talking to you. All right, everybody, that wraps up our mammal case studies for TSR Hub. But don't worry, we've got plenty more Book of Hope case studies and other wildlife cake and cocktails mayhem coming at you soon. You can check out the book now at CSIRO Publishing and plenty of other outlets. Just Google Recovering Australian Threatened Species, a Book of Hope, and check them out online. Cheers, guys. Talk soon.